It's been quite a while since the Neptunia series has last been on my channel. Compile Heart Games have. Just 4 months ago I reviewed the Switch version of Fairy Fencer F, but the Neptunia series hasn't seen a handheld release in a good while. That changes today in a very different RPG in the series. Set in a 2D world instead of 3D, here is my review of Super Neptunia RPG for the Nintendo Switch. Like many games before it, this is set in a different alternate version of game industry outside of the main series. Neptune awakens in the city of Last Station and has once again come down with amnesia. She is quickly found and recruited into a tax collecting organization that goes around and collects 2D games instead of actual money for taxes. But when she finds someone that knows her that is against that organization, she ends up leaving in search of her old allies and her lost memories. Now this game's story is just as funny and entertaining as any of the other Neptunia RPGs. There are a lot of jokes, a lot of references, and a lot of fourth wall breaks that make it a very entertaining read. But what I like the most is what aspect of gaming they center the story around. Instead of focusing on the console wars or piracy, this game focuses on debates on different kinds of game software rather than what console they're made for. And that aspect of the story is implemented really well, especially with the new main characters that pop up in this game. Super Neptunia RPG by gameplay is a side-scrolling turn-based RPG in the vein of old PS1 games like the original Valkyrie Profile. As such, everything in this game is 2D and requires side-scrolling and platforming, whether it's a town, dungeon, or other area. As you might guess, the way progression works is you side-scroll through dungeons, finding your way to the next story objective in next town. Being a side scroller, navigating through each area is a matter of walking left or right and platforming around to find interactable doors and new paths. This also makes every new dungeon feel kind of like a maze. You have a bunch of different exits, but only one is available to you at any given time. When you're trying to get to the Last Station outskirts at the beginning of the game, you actually have exits in the dungeon that go to Louis and a few other places, but NPCs are blocking them, so you can't go there until the story needs you to go there. Dungeons are also filled with a bunch of items and monsters to fight, so there is incentive to platform around and explore every corner of each dungeon outside of just finding where the exits are. In fact, some of the best equipment that I used until the end of the game I found in dungeons and didn't find in shops. Now outside of maze trekking and all of the dungeons, you have two main things that you can do in the game. Outside of your main quest, you have a bunch of side quests that you can get from NPCs that are littered around towns and dungeons, mostly fetch quests, but they can be pretty useful if you need some extra money or experience to get that extra level or get enough money to afford that next sword. None of these are required, but if you're wandering around dungeons picking up everything you say, you will probably end up with a lot of quest items not even knowing it. But the far more in-depth thing here is combat. Neptunia's never really had a 2D fighting system before, and this one is pretty in-depth. Like in Valkyrie Profile, each character's attacks is tied to one of the face buttons, A, B, X, and Y. And you can equip different skills and attacks to your party members based on what kind of weapons they have equipped at the time. This can also change from different formations. Every character has specific skills they can do in each of the 4 slots in that A, B, X, Y formation chart. And when you move just one character around, everyone's skills can change. Just moving the lead character around could change the back row characters from being capable of doing support skills and not being able to do them. It takes a lot of experimentation and trial and error until you get your formation just right. Now once you get into battle, you'll see that this has a very Valkyrie Profile-like system, but it's still very different. Like I said earlier, every character is set to a specific face button for attacking, and every skill that they can be equipped with uses up a certain number of those ATB gauges, so unlike Valkyrie Profile, you can't just start mashing all the different face buttons to put a combo in for each of your characters. You have to wait for that gauge to fill up before you can use those skills. And that depends even more so if you're trying to use those higher end skills that require significantly more gauges than the others. There are ups and downs to this system. On one hand, it starts off very slow, and honestly, if you constantly use higher end skills, it stays slow. But there is a way to quickly get that gauge to fill up, and that is using elemental attacks to expose elemental weaknesses. This puts the enemy in a bit of a stun status and gives you instant access to 2 to 3 more gauges, and for most skills, that means you can just keep firing that skill off again and again and again. This is especially useful for getting through difficult boss fights, because you can either play the waiting game, let's wait for the 3 gauges to fill up, launch an attack, wait for it to fill up again, launch an attack, Or wait for it to fill up once, launch an attack, expose a weakness, instantly get that gauge in, and you can pretty much infinitely just keep launching that attack doing huge amounts of damage until the boss is dead. Granted, they do still get to attack you, so you'll have to watch everybody's health and know when to heal, but you can pretty much cheese your way through a bunch of boss fights like this, including the final boss. But the bigger problem with the combat system is that it doesn't actually change over the course of the game. It's exactly the way it is at the beginning of the game at the end of the game. After all, not all bosses and enemies have elemental weaknesses. No amount of planning is going to get you to escape all of those battles that are going to be those slow wait for the gauge to fill up battles. And now let's get into content and length, which is something I was pretty surprised by. Super Neptunia RPG is probably the shortest Neptunia RPG of the entire series. I did a fair amount of side quests and I got through the final boss fight after playing for a little over 14 hours. There is a little bit of post-game story and dungeon content, but overall you're probably not going to be spending more than 15 hours on this game, making it a very short RPG, especially for that $50 price tag. Now let's get into presentation. Graphically and by design, the game looks beautiful. All of the environments are incredibly detailed and the character models still have that 3D-ish look to how they're animated and how they move around. When it comes to performance, we've got a few things we need to address. First of all, the game has a lot of lag and a lot of skipped frames. The game will often hesitate and freeze for a second when I'm running around a dungeon and trying to platform around, but when you get into combat and do multi-character combos, it gets even worse. Some battles I took part in stressed the game so much that it went into slow motion for a few seconds before it could actually catch up. It's also got a lot of menu lag. When you first boot up the game, the main menu and the customization menu take a while to come up and allow you to actually interact with them. The game will take button commands as soon as you hit the button on your controller, but a lot of times the menu won't actually show the change until several seconds later. I've had situations where I've hit the plus button to open up the main menu and my character just kind of froze in the dungeon for several seconds before the menu actually loaded. Thankfully, Idea Factory International has created a patch to help fix a lot of the game's problems across all three platforms, but in the state it's in right now, it's very unstable and inconsistent. Now let's get out of presentation and into battery life, which is one of the game's best features. Super Neptunia RPG has a battery range of 4 hours and 37 minutes on high settings, up to 5 hours and 46 minutes on low settings. Now in conclusion, Super Neptunia RPG is a very interesting and different take on the franchise. Now on the downside, the game's not very long, the battle system becomes repetitive and slow very quickly, and there are a lot of technical problems that make it a very unstable experience. But if you can overlook these problems or that patch fixes them, this is a fun 2D Neptunia game for fans of 2D gaming. Reviews to Go rates Super Neptunia RPG for the Nintendo Switch a 6.5 out of 10. If you have any comments or questions, feel free to leave them below. Thanks for watching and have a great day.